Please welcome the Education Director for FDIC and the Editor-in-Chief of Fire Engineering, Bobby Halton.
The fire service. FDIC. This is our house. You know, it's undeniable that lately, men and women like us, firefighters, increasingly feel woefully out of place, uncomfortable in most civilian social settings. You know, we're often made to feel as if we should apologize for our beliefs, our values, our opinions. You know, the polite folks say our morals are vintage in character, that maybe we were born a generation or two too late. However, we never feel out of place or uncomfortable among our fellow firefighters, cops, and warfighters, where words like duty, honor, God, service, country need no explanations, need no apologies, and where it's still okay to disagree, at least for most of us, most of the time. Occasionally one of us feels the need, or they feel empowered or compelled, perhaps entitled, to silence or shame one of us, one with whom they disagree. You know, the reason we're experiencing some of these tough conversations in the fire service is complicated, but it is explainable. You know, most of us, we can't count how many times we've been asked, right? Or we've asked others, why? Why did you or why do you want to be a firefighter? The most authentic answer is simply, because I just like to help people. We've long held this answer to be honest, unequivocal, and true, because I just like to help people. Problem is, it's not true. We don't like to help people. Firefighters don't like to help people. We must help people. We're compelled to help people. We can't help ourselves, like the swallows to Capistrano, like the salmon swimming upstream, like politicians lying. It's an unstoppable force of nature. We cannot not help people. We accept that we're obligated to help people. To say that there exists within all of us a sense of obligation is to say that some aspects of our morality are universal. But that universality does not mean that everyone takes up that obligation or that we all share a universal worldview. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Scholars, philosophers, great thinkers throughout time have had no problem espousing their thoughts on obligation. They have thought, they have believed that certain persons are motivated by it. We know firefighters are, but that sense of obligation is now being misunderstood and confused. We hear it online, we read it in after-action reports, and we see it elsewhere. Vilified, especially in hindsight, when things didn't turn out well, as a way of being, a way of acting that is regressive, antiquated, and ignorant. That's understandable. Very understandable, given Western society's cultural drift into homodeism, absolutism, and elitism, and the growing power of an intolerant minority. Strikingly, for the first time in our Western culture, we're experiencing a social mindset that is confident of its moral and intellectual superiority to all who came before them. Some of those attitudes are creeping into the fire service. From this lofty perch, our detractors see all of our traditions, proven and vetted tactical profiles, cultural norms, historical legends, and our relentless innovation and creativity by default as corrupt and deficient. Our detractors, and increasingly the intolerant but polite people, who, lacking skin in the game, have no concept of our sacred sense of obligation, our sacred covenant with our fellow citizens. They confuse it with our social contract, with our subscribed customers. Not out of a maliciousness or evil. Our critics are convinced that they are doing good by protecting us from our vintage selves, enlightening us, and saving us from our outdated morals. They are, however well-intentioned, wrong. They're confusing the sacred covenant with the social contract. We could blame it on one of the most famous opening lines in all of literature. It was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who wrote at the beginning of The Social Contract that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. In fact, the opposite is true. Rousseau was wrong and the polite people are wrong. We are not in chains. True firefighters are grateful we're free to use the insights we're learning from research and science, free to embed it in our proven, vetted tactics, grateful for the increasing knowledge of fire behavior, toxicity, and reactivity. True firefighters embrace all this knowledge. They use it to honor the social contract between us and the customers we serve. We use it to modify our tactics, improve our procedures, and grow as craftspersons. We are enthusiastically doing all of this, embracing all of these concepts and knowledge, all the while aware that it does not interfere with something more sacred, our obligation, when needed, to honor our sacred obligation. Like the first Jews and the first Americans, firefighters have a covenant, a sacred obligation, a primary obligation between us and our fellow citizens. We have second, a contract, a fiduciary obligation, a secondary obligation between us and our customers. There's a difference between a paying customer and a service provider in a social contract, and a threatened citizen and their fellow citizen in a sacred covenant. If you will, some biblical political theory from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Now, in biblical Israel, the people of Israel came to Samuel and they said, "Give us a king." And Samuel got really upset because he was like a prophet, right? And then he went to God, and God got really upset because, well, he was God. But God finally said to Samuel, spell out what having a king will actually mean, and if they're still willing to pay the price, give them a king. Which is what happened. What happened in the days of the prophet Samuel is precisely a social contract, exactly as it was laid out on the lines in the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. People are willing to give up certain of their rights, transfer them to a central power, a king, a government, who undertakes to ensure the rule of law internally and the protection of the realm externally. 1 Samuel chapter 8 is the first recorded incidence in all of history of a social contract. In a contract, you make an exchange. You pay your plumber. You make an exchange. A covenant isn't like that. A covenant is more like a marriage than an exchange. A covenant is sacred, respecting the dignity and the integrity of others in a bond of loyalty and trust. A covenant isn't about me. A covenant isn't about interests. It's about identity. Thomas Paine pointed out they're different. The first, society, covenants, that's about our desires. The second, government, That's about our wickedness. Neither side in this misunderstanding in the fire service is wrong or bad or immoral. Neither side is right or wrong. The confusion has to do with when we're respecting the social contract and when we're honoring the sacred covenant. It was John Stuart Mill who said, one of the worst offenses against freedom is to stigmatize those who hold the contrary opinion as bad and immoral men. Firefighters are consciously respectful of these two universal forces, one to control our wickedness and weakness, and trust me, we have them, and one to raise up our lives and our eternal souls. Firefighters have contracts with governments to work certain hours and take prescribed pay. But we have a covenant with our fellow citizens and our fellow firefighters. And covenants are sacred because they involve sacrifice, real blood and real treasure sacrifices. In the 1920s, there was a German teenager. His name was Viktor Frankl. He wrote a paper on psychology's thoughts at the time on suicide. It was so well done, it caught the attention of one Sigmund Freud for its brilliance. Victor would grow up to become a psychiatrist as an adult, and he worked with women with suicide ideation. In the 1930s, Victor recognized the rising threat from the socialist nationalists, and he secured visas for his wife and himself to emigrate to America. But at the last moment, he recognized his obligation to his aging parents, and he stayed behind in Germany. All of the Frankls would end up in concentration camps. Victor would be in 3, including Auschwitz. All the Frankls except Victor would die, and his sister would die in those inhumane death camps. All he loved was taken. Everything he had was taken, except his sense of purpose, his morality, his sense of obligation to his fellow prisoners. Victor recognized the tyrannical socialists could strip him of everything he had, everything physical and earthly, but not his morality. After his liberation, Victor would write one of the world's most powerful books, Man's Search for Meaning. In that perennial book, Victor taught us that life is meaningless without obligation. Having obligation is what makes our lives meaningful. And in this embrace of obligation, the firefighter is not unique or unusual. We're not special in our own eyes, nor do we seek that recognition from others. That notwithstanding, we are to the most attainable degree possible among the most respected of all our fellow citizens. And it's not for what we do, it's not for our skill or expertise, but rather for the fact that we have chosen freely to be among those rare few whom over the centuries dating back to ancient Greece have taken an oath, have made a covenant, have accepted an obligation. We've pledged, like those ancient Athenians, to fight for the ideals and the sacred things of our city, to revere our laws and to obey them, and to incite a like respect in others. We pledge this freely to God, one another, and our countries. Firefighters embrace living our obligation, commit to delivering on our obligation, and we seek endlessly to honor that obligation. That takes character. Vintage moral character. That demands accepting consequence, embracing randomness, and understanding complexity. But above all, valuing humanity. Christopher Weiss. He grew up the son of an East Orange, New Jersey firefighter. His old man, James, loved the job. But like all of us, he wanted something better for his 3 boys. Regardless of what he wanted, all 3 became East Orange firefighters. In the spring of 1990, Jimmy's youngest, Chris, got promoted to captain on Truck 2. Chris and his crew had just cleared a call for assistance when he notices a civilian doing the frantic wave and pointing at a 10-story fire-resistive high-rise. Chris jogs over, he looks up, and he can see a family of 5 hanging out the windows with a light smoke condition blowing over them. 25 feet away, however, is one victim at a window, and he's got thick, turbulent black smoke blowing out over him. Chris radios in. He tells his driver, set up on the D side, under that isolated victim. Chris could now see embers and flames licking out over that trapped victim. Chris tells firefighter Walter Cosby, Walter, do whatever you have to do, but get that ladder as close as you can to that victim. He was going inside. Alone, Chris runs into the lobby, making his way as fast as he could to the 8th floor. He makes the 8th floor in full gear. Outside, he encounters 2 firefighters outside the door. They tell Chris they didn't think anybody was inside the apartment, and they were waiting for water. Chris tells them there is somebody in there, and he was going in. Chris opens the door. There's fire everywhere. Amazed, one of the firefighters says, what the hell's he doing? At that point, it was too late. Chris was already in. Visibility at the floor is clear, but there's flames everywhere. Chris crawls into the room toward that window. As he moves closer, he realizes the man is no longer there. So he pulls himself up on the window to see where he is. Amazed, Chris realizes that the guy is hanging out the window with one arm just barely inside. 20 feet below him is the tip of the aerial. Standing on the top of the aerial with 1 foot on the second rung is Walter Cosby yelling, hold on, they're coming for you. Chris realizes the danger. He yanks on the man's belt, drags him back down into the building onto the floor of the burning bedroom. The man's not happy about being pulled back inside the fire. The man panics. He tears off Chris's face piece. They struggle. Chris grabs the man and charges as hard as he can towards the door and out into the hallway. Bursting into the hallway, they tumble over an engine company and a bundle of bodies. They're in the hallway laying exhausted. Chris is looking at the victim. The victim looks at Chris and says, but the baby? What about the baby? The man's 7-month-old daughter is still inside the apartment. The line is still not charged. Chris looks at the man. Where's the baby? He points down that hall. All Chris could see was fire. He takes a deep breath. He puts his mask back on. As Chris starts crawling back down the hallway, his face is burning. His ears are burning. The heat's so unbearable that he's doing the lobster call on his elbows, trying to cover his ears. He reaches up to shield the top of his head, and his helmet's missing, and his hair is on fire. Chris throws himself back towards the door. As he does, an engine crew steps over him with a charged line and begins to search inside the building. Chris is still trying to get it together. He's a little bit disoriented, so he figures he'll crawl back down the hallway and open the windows to try to help with venting the room. He could hear some firefighters next door. He yells, "Did you get the baby?" They yelled back, "Yeah, we got a bunch of people." He made his way into the kitchen. He opened the windows. Completely exhausted, he turns, there's still fire, and he starts to make his way out. As he approaches the living room, he walks into a crib. Inside the crib is a little girl. He picks up the baby. She's not breathing. He gets her underneath his coat. He gets down low. He's trying to protect her from the flames as he makes down the hallway. He gets in the hall. "Call EMS! You tell him I'm coming down!" He wanted to start doing rescue breathing, but he could barely breathe himself. So he starts charging down the stairs. When he reaches the 3rd floor, he stops to begin CPR. She coughs. So he gets back up. It gives him the strength to keep going. She starts to convulse. He keeps moving. As he makes the lobby, he hands the baby off to the medics, and he collapses in exhaustion. All the victims, including Chris, went to the hospital. But before he left the scene, he had a chance to ask Walter Cosby, "Walter, what if that guy had jumped? What would you have done?" Walter looked back and said, "I would have tried to catch him and hope for the best." Chris Weiss, Walter Cosby, all of you, persons of character, vintage moral character, persons who have accepted obligation, who celebrate obligation, who understand and honor their obligation to their fellow citizens. That character and consequence, that honor and dedication is what this merry band of brothers and sisters, all you here today, represent. We recognize that accepting obligation doesn't fall equally among all persons. It doesn't fall at all. It's sought after, it's fought for, and it's embraced by very few, by you, by those who find meaning in covenants, not in contracts, in people, not in systems, in nature, not in human creation, but in human endeavor. Find tools, advanced equipments, the latest innovations. They assist us in our pursuit, but meeting that self-imposed obligation at those critical intersections of life and death, that's a matter of character. Vintage moral character. Each of us must honor and respect our covenant and contract each and every moment of each and every day. As such, it's necessary that we come together at FDIC and celebrate that character, celebrate that covenant, and we cannot allow those intolerant people with no skin in the game who misunderstand the difference between contracts and covenants, who confuse obligation with opportunity to get between us and our mission, to get between us and one another. These intolerant but well-meaning people have been so deluded by academia, the so-called experts, the elitists. You see, to the academics, there's no difference between academia and the real world. Firefighters know better. In the real world, there is. Our fire service operates forward in the real world, not in a laboratory or a classroom, not in some theory, not in some construct of how the world should work. In the real world, we operate in the real world with real people and real problems in real time against real threats. Those threats require we're morally and spiritually grounded, emotionally and spiritually prepared. For if the time should come that we must place mission over self, we honor that ancient obligation. Victor, Chris, and Walter were not fulfilling a contract. Victor, Chris, and Walter were not in some quid pro quo exchange. They were living up to principles. They were respecting an oath. They were honoring an obligation. Like them, Victor, Walter, and Chris, we can never accept defeat. We must always improvise, fight, and when necessary, honor our obligation to our last defiant breath. And it's right and necessary that we do so. Quite honestly, we don't care what's polite in today's social settings, and we don't care if we make the so-called polite people uncomfortable. Maybe we were born a generation or two too late. We don't care. Regardless, we refuse to apologize for our beliefs, our values, and our vintage moral character. We enthusiastically embrace our internal drive to conform to our classical and ancient and ancestral notions of justice and honor. We are proud that our morals are vintage in character. We celebrate that we have an obligation to defend American citizens, her towns, her villages, her visitors, her guests, her principles, her virtues, and her honor. You're damn right. Duty, honor, country, God, and obligation need no explanations in this house. In this house, we fly one flag. We are America's firefighters. God bless you all.